Coming to you from the dining room table at East Barbary Lane, welcome to a special episode of Full Circle, the podcast. I am your host, Charles Tyson Jr., and today I am delighted to be sitting with our guest. He is a wonderful author, storyteller, educator, and witty human being. Wayne Scott is here to talk about his memoir, The Maps They Gave Us, One Marriage Reimagined. And I am here to tell you that it is a wonderful read, and I can't wait to talk to him about it. Wayne, how are you? Welcome to the Full Circle table.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. It's an honor.
I've been looking forward to this. I just finished the last 30 pages.
Oh my gosh.
Last night.
Bless you. I'm bowing to you. Like not like feed the writer's soul, like somebody, especially in this day and age, somebody saying they read it. I mean, my gosh.
Oh, I inhaled everything but the last 30 pages in like less than a week because I read it while I'm at work because I have a little bit of downtime at work.
Okay.
And then I got busy and I had the last 30 pages and it was causing me to have a little tick. It's only 30 pages.
Wow. Okay. That's so cool for me to hear.
So this is a deeply personal story, obviously.
Yeah.
Memoirs usually are. But you talk about a lot of deep things, family, identity, sexuality. Why don't you tell us a little bit about, or more than a little bit, what The Maps They Gave Us is about?
Yeah. Well, first of all, maybe what I can say is where the title comes from. The title comes from a love poem that was written by the lesbian feminist poet Adrienne Rich in the 70s, a series of poems called the 21 Love Poems, and it was about the beginning of her relationship with another woman. And it was very much about what it's like to love each other in a world that's hostile to your love. And so the line is, whatever we do together is pure invention. The maps they gave us were out of date by years.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And so she's very much talking about how for queer couples, we have to chart our own course. We have to forge a different path. You know, we can't actually fit into the kind of heteronormative containers that are supplied to us. They won't fit. And so we have to figure out, sometimes creatively, imaginatively, we have to design our own containers. And so this very much fits with my experience. My spouse and I are in what psychologists, I'm going to use a clunky term here, what psychologists call a mixed orientation relationship, which means she's straight and I'm not. You know, I identify as queer or bisexual. And you know, those don't fit. Those kinds of relationships don't fit in the usual heteronormative script. Although, you know, I'm not unlike many bisexual guys who marry women and move in straight passing relationships, in that you try. This is the form, the container that is given to you by the people that you want to please and get approval from, ministers, family, things like that. And so you try. And you know, when my spouse and I made our marriage vows, right? We were in our late 20s, and you don't know. What do you know? What do you know?
You don't know much in your 20s.
No, and you don't know much in your 60s. I mean, you can't foretell, right? You can't see what life is going to be like. You don't know a lot about what it's going to be like to get older, to age. You don't know, like, the ways in which desire and intimacy shift and evolve as two people are aging together within the same receptacle. And so for us, at least, the heteronormative container we had, it didn't fit at a certain point. At about the 15-year mark, we had a bit of a crisis, and I realized I had kind of lopped off this huge important part of myself. It's almost like I had forgotten who I was in a way that I just kind of, I couldn't tolerate anymore. The loneliness and the desperation and the desolation was too much. And I also I didn't know how to talk to her about it because, again, with the script that was supplied to us about what a heteronormative marriage is supposed to look like, for me to initiate the conversation would be to initiate a conversation about divorce.
Mm.
That's
Hmm.
that's how it felt. Like we have a very binary way of thinking about all these different, whether it's male or female, or
Monogamy or
gay or
not.
straight, or marriage or divorce,
Right. Yeah.
or monogamy or not. Like they're very polarized ways, and in fact, human relationships and humans are messier and more fluid than that,
True
right?
that.
And we need to find containers. Maybe we need to reimagine containers that are going to allow us more room to grow, to evolve, to heal sometimes.
Right. And I think it also comes down to, I think, wiring, because some
Mm,
people, I was actually just having this conversation a couple of days ago, how, like, I don't think I'm wired for something like an open relationship.
mm-hmm.
Like, and I think part of that is, in my 20s and 30s, I was such a hoe. So when I'm ready to settle down, I'm ready to like settle down.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Um, and I'm seeing more and more with friends that they're exploring open relationships. And to me, from the outside, it just looks so messy.
Yep. No, you're right. It is messy.
But if it works, I mean, I try to like not sit in judgment, because if it's working for you and no one's getting hurt, who am I to have anything to say?
Yeah.
But yeah, I just don't think I'm wired that way. So if you are, good Godspeed, you know what I mean?
Well, and I actually appreciate you saying what you just said because I think it's very important to come into any conversation like this without an agenda and without being prescriptive or dogmatic that one relationship form is superior to another. We all have to find our way, right? And actually, when you first said I am not wired for non-monogamy, honestly, Charles, I would have said that. I would have said that a couple of years ago too. And the period of time that's depicted in the memoir is a period it's a crucible. It's a period of intense struggle with this couple trying this marital experiment. Can we transition into a non-monogamous form from what we had? And we didn't know it was going to work. We really didn't. We thought of it as an experiment, and it was quite fraught for about a year. It was quite fraught.
Hmm.
But at a certain point, as with everything, you do it enough, you start to develop your routines and your grooves and your guardrails, and you figure out this is how we can make this safe. And one of the biggest ways for us that's in the memoir that we made it safe was to make sure that we always honored our bond to each other.
Right.
That we had to continuously nurture our bond and have very open discussions about, how were these other relationships going to be, where were they going to sit in relationship to the thing that was important to both of us, which is was both our bond but also our family. We had 3 school-age children.
Right. Yeah, it felt very like our marriage is this, anything else is that, and that cannot affect this, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I want to say too, like because I'm a psychotherapist myself, and I work with a lot of non-monogamous couples. There's so many forms this takes, and in many ways, I probably have, I'm probably more vanilla flavor of polyamory than the average person, in that we really do like our marriage is the central thing, and then we have outside relationships.
Right.
And not everybody does it that way. Some people do it in a way where they're more equal egalitarian. All relationships are important. There's just so many ways to do it, and I have respect for all of them actually. And then I have respect for people who are in monogamous bonds as well. It's hard no matter what you do, right? It's both joyful, but it's also a struggle whenever two people are trying to move through life in tandem.
Right. And I guess it comes down to, what are the needs being met by each relationship?
Yeah, right.
Because I mean, not everyone can't be everything.
Mhm.
So you need to find the healthiest way to get those needs met, keeping everyone basically safe and sane. It's a
Yeah.
it's a tap dance, I feel.
Yeah, no, it is a dance, and you have to be conscious of what your partner's doing, what they're needing.
Hmm.
You have to keep your eyes on each other out of a place of caring.
A very tense part for me, anyway, I was like literally on the edge of my seat when I was reading, was the moments when you both made the decisions to introduce the other to your other,
Mhm.
and then you're both having varying degrees of, how should I be?
Mhm.
Wait, I kind of like this person. Should I like this person? Am I liking them too
Uh-huh.
much?
Right, I know. Yeah, no, I mean, it's when we first started down this path, we decided that because of our own history, because of our own emotional dynamic, if we were going to have this experiment, she had to go first. She had to make connections with other people and see how that would go for her. It couldn't be me going first. Um,
Because that would be too close to what
I think
happened
because of
initially.
yeah, and I think I think it would could be seen as self-serving. I just she was the more I think she was of the two of us, she was a little bit more ambivalent about going down this path. I mean, I also had my anxieties about it, but I think she had a little bit more ambivalence, and so just out of respect for for me not to get out too far ahead of her, to
Right.
respect her pace. Yeah, yeah, basically that was it. But the thing is, even when she sort of was connecting with other men, having dates and things like that, it was like very threatening for me. Like
I can imagine.
I didn't think it would be. But it was, and the first couple times she went out, these are all stories that are in the memoir. I was miserable. I was miserable at home,
Hmm.
waiting. Like I kept thinking I should have something to do productive with my time to distract myself. I should watch a movie, stuff like that. And I kept just be like, I'm just waiting. I was just like waiting, looking out the window at the parking spot where her car was supposed to be, just waiting for her to come home, which is
Right.
just the worst thing you can do. It's not. I do not advise that as a way to deal with the first a few times your partner goes out on a date, but that's what I did. I just made myself miserable. Um,
Right. And then when she comes home and she's not miserable, she had the nerve to have a good time, then that leaves room to
yeah,
be resentful.
I mean, what a lot of non-monogamous couples refer to that as reentry dynamics. When you come back
Mm.
to the person who was left,
Mm-hmm.
and both people often are in very different emotional spaces that way. And you got to have conversations about how do we want to navigate that. What's the level of transparency we want to have about what each of us is up to and things like that. What's the right level of connections to each other's lives as well as protection, you know?
Right.
Um,
And I imagine also, because what basically was the impetus for this whole thing was, you had a moment of, we'll call it infidelity. Um, and so you probably had a moment of like, do I even have the right to have any feelings about this?
yeah, definitely there was betrayal, right? And there were behaviors that I am not proud to talk about. But I
Mm.
think, like many human beings, I had kind of backed myself into a corner, having agreed to a marital form that didn't allow me enough room to even have that conversation that this isn't working or fitting for me. Like I didn't know how to have that conversation because to have that conversation would be akin to asking for divorce within the model we had been supplied,
Right.
right? And my thing was, I want to be married to you. I'm still in love with you. I don't ever want to not be with you, but I also want to be able to acknowledge this other part of who I am, right? And again, there's a lot of erasure in our culture around when it comes to queer and bisexual, especially bisexual identities.
Who you telling?
So, right,
and
right, right. So,
then that's the thing. Like as a bisexual man, like I
hmm
completely understand. That's why when I was still dating cisgender women,
hmm
they had to be queer. They
mm-hmm.
had to. Like
I
straight girls
I
were
get
off the
that.
table.
Yeah, because then they would understand. They would be
Right.
able to. I mean, it wouldn't mean it would completely easy, but they would understand why you couldn't just kind of buy into a heteronormative container. That wasn't going to fit for you.
Right.
Hmm
And then because inevitably the tired tropes start coming in. Well, I can't compete with a man. It's not a competition, hon.
Yeah, yeah,
Or you're just gay.
right,
Obviously not.
right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. I learned there's a potential when you go down this path to learn an awful lot about yourself that you wouldn't know otherwise. So like,
Mm,
I mentioned that when she would go out on dates, I would stay at home and have a private little crisis of masculine pride. A
mm-hmm,
lot of stuff, insecurity came up about my own male identity, and having grown up as a kind of a misfit boy, right,
mm-hmm,
in a heteronormative world, being very kind of gender atypical myself,
mm-hmm.
um, I had absorbed a lot of shame. There was a lot of residual shame that I just don't fit in this world. I'm not right. There's something wrong
Mm-hmm.
with my boyhood, my masculinity, and this came up very powerfully for me when she went out with a regular heterosexual guy.
Right.
He was the better guy.
A
He
normal guy. I'm in air
yes, yes,
quotes.
and there's some part of me wanted to be a normal guy. Who doesn't? When they're a kid, especially.
Right.
You want because what you would be safe then people wouldn't pick on you as much.
Right.
So a lot of stuff, but interestingly, because we had committed this to this path of non-monogamy, the way that I had to manage that internal sense of threat, I couldn't try to control her and say, well, you just can't do that anymore because it brings up too much unpleasantness in me. I couldn't do
Right.
that.
Right.
You actually have to go inward and say, okay, I need to understand this part of myself. And for me, painful as it was a really, really important reckoning, that I had still had absorbed so many messages that there was something wrong with the way I showed up as a guy in the world that
Mm.
I needed to still let go of. I needed to shed those supplied and destructive definitions of masculinity. That
Right.
the way that I was a man was perfectly fine.
Exactly. And, I've been a huge proponent of the idea that there is more than one way to be a man.
Mhm.
And I used to say there's no wrong way, but examples that make that statement wrong keep coming up these days, so whatever. But yeah, I totally get that. Um and when you're a bisexual man, you're walking that line because if you're dating men, if you're in the space where that is the accepted norm, then you run the risk of not being gay enough.
Mhm.
And then in the other half of that, you're quote unquote too gay. So it's like, how do I set those levels?
Yeah.
It's a unique thing for queer and bi folks.
Yeah, and I still there's like a little guilty confession here, but like I still feel like I have a very uneasy relationship to the words queer and gay because experientially I feel like I belong, but I mean I still live under the same roof with my wife.
Mm-hmm.
I still have enormous privileges in moving through the world in a straight passing relationship. And so sometimes I feel like sometimes when I refer to myself as being queer, I feel like I'm going to get thrown out of the club, or that there's some kind of police that are going to show up and say, you know what,
Mm-hmm.
no, you're not living with enough danger and risk.
Right.
Um, but I mean, I think I mean, I mean, I'm not as straight passing now as I was pre having all these publications. Like
Right.
now most people know that I'm an oddball. I'm a kind of my own weirdo. And I'm happy that way. I'm happy. I'm kind of proudly kind of charting my own path, but didn't always used to be that way.
Well, I know. I think it was at your wedding or after the wedding. I think you like said to your mom, "Can you like just drop a little hint about my queerness just to let people know?"
Yeah, that I'm not that when even though we were getting married in a relatively conventional looking form, that at least at that point in the game, I didn't want people to think I was losing that awareness who I was. I didn't want it to be perceived as me converting, right? That
Right.
was actually the most frightening thing of all, is that anyone witnessing our marriage would think, oh, gay men can just change them. Let's just ask them all to change. Let's just start putting pressure on our sons to sort of like to go back out, to go out with girls, and if they just give it a try, they'll be that would to me would be the most toxic thing for
Right.
people to take from our being together, our wedding ceremony.
Right.
And
They
yet
told you all you
we're,
need to do is find the right girl. Yeah.
yeah, but in a world that is still still to this day so hostile to queer
More so,
people.
it feels
Oh
like
my
almost.
God, it's getting. I mean, I feel like we made so much progress, and now I just feel like it it is. I never thought it could be so terrifyingly retro.
Thank you. I. It's funny. I'm revisiting so many conversations that I've been having with you today. I was just talking about how, I came out in the early 90s, and like that whole decade, queerness was still taboo.
Yeah.
We were on the, well, not really the tail end of, but we're on the later part of the AIDS
Yeah. Still dangerous.
epidemic.
Very dangerous still.
Right. Sex of any kind still has that specter around it. Um, People were still equating homosexuality with AIDS.
Yes.
So there was still that permeating homophobia in society. So that's what we were dealing with.
Yeah.
So my queerness and my being out throughout that decade um, felt very confrontational. It felt very
Hmm.
punk rock. It felt very I'm here. You're going to deal with me. You're going to like it, and if you don't
Yeah.
like it,
Yeah.
fuck you. And it's starting to feel like that again.
Yeah. Hmm.
Like, I haven't had a bottle thrown at me from a moving car in broad daylight yet. So at least it's different in that sense. But
Yeah. Right.
so yeah, we're going backwards.
Yeah. It's interesting to me. And I might get sad talking about this because it just hits so close to home. But the degree to which our larger authoritarian structures are picking on trans kids
Mm-hmm.
is just killing me, because I'm so much more aware currently, and I'm a parent. I'm so much more aware now of how incredibly vulnerable that tiny group of kids are in the world. And they do not need any more hostility piled on top of them. They do not need any more people in the world telling them there's something wrong with them. They are already a bit vulnerable in this, kind of brutal world. But then
Just
there's
being
this,
a kid.
just being a kid is vulnerable, but then being a kid who doesn't kind of fit
Right.
the mold. I mean, I think it's a little bit easier depending on what region of the country you're in. But the other piece of me, remembering back to our history, and Stonewall, is remembering, what? Watch who you pick on. Watch who you
Mm-hmm.
pick on, because, the first people who fought back at Stonewall were our non-binary siblings. They were the
Mm-hmm.
they were the first people to fight back with ferocity.
Mm-hmm.
And people sometimes forget that. So there's also a part of me that's like, we have been here before, where there was this cultural animosity towards the queer community. We've been here before, and in a way, we kind of know what to do.
Right.
You just don't lose your voice. The people who are positioned to be strong, and to raise their voice, have to keep doing that. And I see them out there. I see people out there saying that this is wrong, what we're doing and how we're talking. Especially, again, I'm just particularly sensitized now to the plight of trans kids. Um, but we got to stay strong.
Indeed, we really do. And luckily, we now come from that stock of activism and rebelliousness,
Hmm.
you know, and this is the part that it cracks me up because it's, the idea that queer folks are weak. It's like we spent
Yeah.
a lot of our lives fighting. Like
Hmm.
what makes you think, and we have these people that, the ones making these decisions are overfed, overprivileged, never had to go through anything
Yeah.
significant.
Can't
And they're
understand.
right. And they're coming at us who've had to like overcome all of the things,
Mhm.
make something fabulous out of nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, why do you think that you can come for us like that?
Right. 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 Yeah, I mean, and I love you saying, I love that you just said making something fabulous out of nothing, because I mean the teeny tiny consolation that for me is coming out of this brutal period of history that we find ourselves in is that these are the kinds of crucibles that produce extraordinary art. Like I say,
Mm.
I think about like James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, which to
Mm-hmm.
me is like this, to say it's path breaking for what it was doing in the 50s,
Mm.
is to diminish it. It was like
Right.
I mean like it was visionary. I mean, and actually, one of the things in my memoir, I there was
I
a
love the way you say
reckoning.
memoir.
There's a reckoning with the fact that, what, I'm not actually doing anything particularly new or innovative here. There is a legacy of queer and feminist writers and people and heroes who have lit the way, if you can only find them. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You just got to find them. We got to this is why banning books is so incredibly dangerous, right? Is
Mm-hmm.
because it erases history and culture, marginalized cultures that in fact show, you're it's like Baldwin says, you're suffering, you think your suffering is unique, you think it's the worst thing that's ever happened in the world. It's not.
Right.
It's not. Other people have done this, and if you can find those examples, right? There's a scene in the memoir early on. As during the, just like you, I kind of was coming of age during the AIDS pandemic, and I found out that one of my former boyfriends had probably had AIDS. So
Mm-hmm.
I had to go through getting tested, and at that time,
Mm-hmm.
you would wait 3 or 4 weeks for your results.
I
This
know.
unbearable period of like, and I was sick during the time. I had a really bad cold that wouldn't go away, probably because of the stress. So
Mm-hmm.
I really thought
This is it.
that, yeah, I really thought this was it. But in that time of crisis, when I was so miserable and so alone too, because I didn't tell anybody I was waiting for my HIV test results. I was too embarrassed
Of
and
course, yeah.
ashamed, right? I discovered Audre Lorde's The Cancer Journals. Her
Mm-hmm.
her intimate exploration of what it was like as a African American lesbian feminist woman to have breast cancer in a world that politicizes that disease and blames the victims.
Right.
And it was really like she was like she was like my best friend during that time. Like, I slept with that book, and it's a
Right.
thin book. I just read and reread the Cancer Journals because I just was like, she is my fellow traveler.
Mm-hmm.
She has already gone down this path. And it's interesting too because in '87 when I read the Cancer Journal, she was still alive.
Right.
I think she died a couple of years later. But and that's the sort of the brilliant thing about literature is, it's our cultural DNA. Even after the writer dies, they're still there.
Yeah, and you talk about this rich legacy, this tapestry of, the work of queer artists and queer writers. And it's so rich, and it makes me sad because, there used to be a time when the queer community at large, all the letters,
Mhm. Mhm.
we had more of a community. We were able to lean on each other more.
Yeah. Yeah.
We were all in the same gang, as it were. And I feel like now, and there are obvious, exceptions. There always has been, because racism has always been a thing, misogyny has always been a thing.
Mhm.
But I feel like more so now, the infighting, the way we just eat our own,
Mhm.
it's we have to, and I guess it's because it's been easier. I
Maybe,
put in
right?
italics and air quotes
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I know what you're saying. I know what
for
you're saying.
a couple of decades that we don't feel the need to have to lean on each other as much.
Yeah,
We were able to have a little bit more autonomy. We don't need to all gather in the hole in the wall gay bar.
yeah,
The lesbians and the queer men and the trans folks and the drag queens, because
yeah.
the men can go on Grindr and order dick like pizza now, so we don't need that whole aspect of community is lost. That's the part that makes me sad. That coupled with banning books that are our history,
Yeah,
trying to prevent the next generation from learning about where we come from.
yeah.
It's it's
The
yeah,
one thing that's kind of like interesting to me about, I don't know, about conversations about book banning and this in the day of the internet, right? It's like it's really not just these physical books we burn. Like the toothpaste is already out of the tube. Like really,
right.
you really think you're going to eradicate this? Like I know, like I feel for queer and marginalized kids in red states. I wish I could create a pipeline where they could just come to Portland, Oregon, where I live, which is
Right.
very progressive. But but it's out there. You like like do we really think we can just completely erase it?
Right.
It's out there, and people will be able to find, if people are determined, they will find their examples and their history.
Mhm.
It's just we are. You said we kind of have had a period where maybe it felt a little bit easier, and you put that in scare quotes, and I agree. There were protections that we had coming of age that our forebears didn't have. Certainly,
Right.
James Baldwin didn't have them, right?
True.
Um, and also there's been a visibility, I think, with the internet, that has also been problematic in some ways, but also in many ways it's been really profound,
Oh yes.
especially for people growing up in more isolated areas where they don't have many role models.
Right. Right.
Um, so it's just hard for me to like it's hard for me to imagine that it's I think it's an old fashioned thing to think you're going to ban these books. They're out there.
Exactly.
They're
Oh,
out
and
there.
I say many times on the podcast, what would be a really bad idea, young queer people in small towns, if you were to find someone on the internet that's from a big city with a big library, and let them borrow their library card and go on the Libby app, and then you have access to all these books. That would be a really bad idea. You
Yeah.
shouldn't do that. Don't do that. Wink, wink.
Mhm. Yeah, 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 yeah. Right. Right. I'm a parent. I have three children. They're all in their early 20s now, but I remember when they were, even before they were teenagers, they had access to the internet. And this idea as parents, this older idea that we somehow controlled what information they had access to. I mean,
Right.
that was ridiculous. They knew everything that was going on in the world before we did because they
Hmm.
were on their phones. I didn't do a great job of like titrating my children's exposure to the, to the world through the internet and through their phones. But yeah, the kids will figure it out.
Oh yeah, that's as long as there have been kids and parents, there have been kids figuring out ways to sneak to do the
Hmm.
things that they're not
Yeah,
supposed to do.
yeah, and I think we got to hold on to that during this really vulnerable, hostile period in history to remember that like we are still designed to survive under adverse circumstances. We are,
Hmm.
and yeah.
It's in our DNA at this
Hmm.
point.
Yeah, yeah.
You can't stop the beat. um, so in addition to your telling of your story and the challenges you met with your marriage, you also had a particularly difficult relationship with your father.
Mm.
That was a very poignant part of the book. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for asking about that. I think very fraught relationship with my father, who for most of my life was a pretty pretty lost in his alcoholism.
Mm.
And he was also very kind of conventionally socialized as a cisgendered male. And so one of my father's big influences in life was this cowboy western. It was a film that came out in the 1950s called Shane.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and Shane is the original rugged individualist who calls the shots and is celebrated for keeping his secrets from people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And doesn't, tells everybody that he meets, don't get too attached to me because when I leave, and nobody follows me. I'm my own person. I'm not going to get bogged down in the frills of the domestic front, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Shane comes to this town in the Wyoming territory and befriends a farmer and his wife and their 8-year-old son Joey. And the book is from the perspective of Joey, and it's a very campy story about this hyper masculine character, and that was my dad's role model.
Right.
That was who kind of defined who he was. And when I was 8 or 9 years old myself, at about 11 o'clock at night, my dad comes up to my bedroom and wakes me up and says, "It's on. You got to see it." The movie Shane is on the Late Show, so he carries me downstairs, and I was like this mandatory conscript. He's going to show me Shane because he's giving me a survival strategy, because he knew I was a kid that was bullied a lot, and Shane is the role model of how to fight back because Shane is always pulling out his guns whenever anybody pisses him off.
Right.
He just shoots them. So that was the role model. And
it makes you wonder how much of a role model he was for so many more men, because
he was definitely a role model for my dad, because when
right.
I was 14, my dad left. Just in the same way that Shane got on his horse and rode off into the horizon and said, "No one's allowed to follow me," that my dad did that too.
Right.
And so growing up, I didn't actually make the connection between my dad's script for his life and Shane, the movie that he worshipped and loved so much. But I made it later, and it's in the memoir. I made it later in life. I realized, that was his script.
Mm-hmm.
That was his justification. That was his rationale for living this life that was in so many ways, so disappointing to his sons and his wife, because he really just left and didn't tell us where he was going.
Right.
So that was the role model. And I struggled with my dad throughout my life. Struggled trying to help him get into rehab, and we not successfully. Right? He actually is one of those, when his death certificate came back when he died about 20 years ago, it said cause of death. It said drinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I didn't know you could die from a behavior. I thought it would be some fancy Latin diagnostic word, but
Right.
It's just one word: drinking.
Right, because you hear the phrase "drinking himself to death,"
Kind of.
and it feels like a metaphor.
Yeah.
But no, you can actually do that. There were a couple of things you said in regards to your father in the book that just let the air out of my sails. The one moment was when you asked him, "Are you saying that you're choosing the bottle over us?" basically. And he said, "Yeah, I am."
Yeah.
I was just like, wow. But it's like the honesty of that, but at the same time, well, damn.
Yeah. Well, it's actually it's interestingly chilling for me to hear you mirror that back, that scene from my life, because it was at the same, on the one hand, it was so incredibly painful to hear him say that, but on the other hand, it was kind of a gift of liberation, because
Right, sure.
he was kind of saying, you can't rescue me,
Right.
you got to let this one go.
Yeah.
And it actually did. It freed me up. That scene occurs right in the chapter before my spouse and I decide to get married. I was suddenly freed up
Right.
to have other adult relationships. I didn't have to give so much of my psychological real estate to this man who was admittedly kind of lost in his alcoholism. So yeah, a painful moment, but also weirdly kind of a gift. And it's one of those things too, like when he said the alcohol is more important than you to me, um, it wasn't like he was actually telling me something I didn't already intuit.
Right.
I mean, the example of his whole life up to that point was that yes, of course, he's always choosing the alcohol over being a sober, conversationalist with me.
Right.
Right? It was only when he was just days from his deathbed that I had a conversation with him sober for the first time in really a very long time.
Wow.
Years went by and I hadn't seen him sober.
Yeah.
So,
And I imagine there had to have been a little bit of hope that by asking the question that would have like awakened something and snapped him out of something. But,
yeah,
you know,
you keep hoping, when you're a kid, this whole idea of codependence, which is such an old-fashioned idea now, I'm
mm,
really skeptical about it in many ways because if you have a loved one, if you have a family member who's suffering with a chronic disease, and alcoholism is just a chronic disease. It is not a personal
right,
failing, it's a chronic disease.
right,
But there's a behavioral component to it as well where some people do kick it, right? Some people
right,
do get into recovery, and so you always hope that your parent will be the one
right.
that kicks it, right? Mine was not. Mine was not. But it does give me this incredible appreciation whenever I meet any person who's a parent, especially a father who has gone from being an alcoholic to being in recovery. I'm like I'm thrilled. I'm inspired by their example.
Mm-hmm.
The gift
Mm-hmm.
that they are giving to their children.
Yeah. Um, and the other moment that gutted me um, was I think it was either at the funeral or around that immediate time, and you were hearing everyone tell these stories about how much they loved him and how much
Mm,
they had these affectionate feelings for him, and you had that moment of like, did I love him? I don't
mm.
think I did.
Yeah. Well, thank you for mentioning that. I had this incredible gift from the universe a couple of years after my dad died, which is that some of his very good friends from his Navy days
I love
reached
this
out to
part.
me. I'm
Yeah.
like you. I'm a junior. I see you've got junior in your name. I'm also a junior. I'm named after my dad. So that's another weird gift that he gave me or that I was given. And so this guy reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm looking for a Wayne Scott who served in the Navy during these years. Is that you or is he in a relationship to you?" And I was like, "Well, that was my dad."
Right.
And the friends didn't know that he had died because he had fallen out of touch with them. But I said, "Yeah, he passed away." Yada yada. They invited me to their reunion. They said, "You know what? We're getting together to reminisce. Why don't you come? You come in your dad's place." And so I went to this gathering of these four friends of my dad. They had known him since he was a teenager. And of course, they had a very different relationship with him. I was the disappointed son, right?
Right.
But they were the drinking buddies.
Right.
They were the people who went through young adulthood with him, and they had nothing but happy, fun memories of him. And it was kind of fun to realize that, you know what, I actually might have liked him if I hadn't been an economic dependent. Like
Right.
if I
That's
hadn't
real.
needed, if developmentally, in my experience of him, I hadn't needed him to show up in certain ways. But if I had just met him at a bar, actually, I might have liked him. I probably
Yeah.
would have really enjoyed him. And so it actually expanded my capacity for empathy into his life. I
Mm-hmm.
actually was able to recognize, you know what? He was a funny, likable, loving man to many, many people in his life. He wasn't great with kids.
Right.
He wasn't.
Not
Um,
everybody. Not everybody's meant to be a parent.
yeah, yeah. But I also had this example, like with these men, they're so gruff, and they're all, I'm sure, Republican. I know many of them. I still keep in touch with many of them. I know they voted for Trump,
Mm,
but they were so kind to me, and I really think it was because of their connection with my dad. They were
right.
kind of like these grandfathers by proxy,
Mm-hmm.
right? My own dad wasn't alive to be able to coo over his grandchildren, but they
Right.
wanted to see pictures of my kids, and they cooed, and it
Yeah.
was and it was a gift. It was a gift. It was I was like, okay, well, I didn't get the benefit of being able to see my dad live into his 70s and maybe see if he would have changed. But these men who were his friends and who knew him, they came into my life and they helped me heal something. They really did help me heal something, and it was from the most unlikely place. You wouldn't think that these older white guys, MAGA Republicans, would be so kind to this like progressive social worker guy from Portland, Oregon,
Right.
who's very queer identified.
Right. And I love how you had described a photograph of your father with his drinking buddies, and the picture I got in my head was like, this is kind of homoerotic, but beside the point. And when they basically demanded that you take a picture with them,
Yeah.
and when you said I was in my father's place, I was just like, oh.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean the ultimate and unexpected experience of belonging where you never thought you'd belong.
Right.
And they had this picture that was taken in the 50s when they were in the service, when they were out having a wild night on the town, of the five of them standing next to each other with these big shit-eating grins on their face and beers and cigarettes and all that kind of stuff. And basically what we literally did is we recreated that photo with me in the place where my dad was.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So it was a gift.
It's like that internet trend of families recreating their childhood photos.
Yeah, that's fun. Yeah, with a bunch of older guys. Yeah.
I love the way you have with words when you write. The book is such an easy read because you have this comfortable voice and you
Mm.
have a wit, and there are things that are just downright funny. Like the first thing um I had marked, I'm probably not going to find it by the end of this sentence, but you had mentioned when you were exploring being with women, and you said you wanted to be good at it, and you had heard about the term going down, and
Right.
you said, I much prefer the word cunnilingus. It sounds like something you would do at a wine tasting.
Right. Right. So,
I cackled.
I appreciate you saw the humor in that.
where where would you say that your humor comes from? I mean, I think I know the answer to this, but where would you say your humor comes from?
Hmm. Wow. That I hadn't thought about that. Well, maybe just because we were just talking about him. I mean, my dad was hilariously funny,
Hmm.
and was very charming in groups of people, and I always knew that he was funny. And
Hmm.
that was something both my parents put a lot of value on humor and seeing the humorous in life. And then I think that got potentiated
Hmm.
when I found myself a member of the queer community, because I think, you know, gay men and lesbians and queer people, I think they're hilariously funny. They have to
Hmm.
be.
Right.
Like it's their coping mechanism and
Right.
strategy. And like part of that whole section that you were talking about where the younger version of me has got this kind of scorecard where he's keeping track of all the different sexual acts he's participated in and what he's
Right.
still got to do. It's his to-do list of sex, which I'm
Uh-huh.
so ashamed of now in retrospect. But that is the way I thought when I was 19,
Same.
20.
I hear you.
I mean, not proud, but it's true to who I was. Um, that yeah, it also speaks to the limitations of the language and the ways we had of thinking about, that meant the script I was given about sexuality at that age was that it was a series of accomplishments. It was bases
Mm.
to be run, which is
Hmm.
terrible. Which is terrible. I was not given this idea that I was not given this idea of intimacy.
Right.
Of actual genuine intimacy and how and what sex is really like separate from the pornographies that are
Right.
offered to us culturally,
Right.
right? And there's a point where I'm with my spouse, and we're going down that path and I realize, oh my god, that list, I have to forget that list ever existed.
Right.
You know.
Right. And going back to the rule book of being a man, it's
Hmm.
like when you think about it, the quote unquote traditional correct way to be a man doesn't really serve them.
Mm-mm.
It definitely doesn't make them ideal partners.
No.
You come from this mindset of sex is transactional. Sex is something that you win.
Hmm.
You know, being emotionally unavailable, showing emotions is considered weak. It's like, there's a whole TikTok uh, genre, I'll call it. This gentleman named Barrett Paul, and he has this whole thing about why we don't need straight men. And it's very much that. It's like if your idea of what makes you a man is entrenched in all of these things
Yeah.
that don't make you a great person,
Yeah.
and all the qualities that we associate with being weak, with being queer, those are the things that are actually goals.
Yes.
It's like, how did we end up here?
Right. Right. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting as you were talking, I was thinking about the way in which the Cowboy Shane story, kind of laid the roadmap for my dad, and I think he wanted to lay that roadmap for me. And Shane is very connected to the tragic history of Western expansion and imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
The story takes place in Wyoming. There is, in both the movie and the book it's based on, there is not a single reference to indigenous people at all. And yet, of course, we know from archives and from history that there had been this forcible, violent um,
Yep.
erasure
Yep.
of those people. But it's not even mentioned, right? But what is mentioned is that men have secrets and
Uh-huh.
men protect their secrets, and that is to be celebrated. That a man knows who he is and that he doesn't have to tell you anything he doesn't want to tell you, and he gets to whitewash and tell what the truth is, and that truth doesn't have to even acknowledge that you exist. And
Right.
so it's interesting to me, like having this like intimate experience with my dad of his abandonment of our family, his devaluing of family relationships, and then realizing this connects to these broader forces in history that don't care about community, that only care about power and expansion and
Right.
control and imperialism, right? And how much that is, that's the roadmap that boys, white boys especially, are given.
Mm.
White
Yeah.
heterosexual boys are given um, to their detriment because it doesn't make them happy people.
Right. And if you really think about it, like male cisgender heterosexuality is more homosexual in that, like, they don't really seem to like women.
Hmm.
Like, queer men like women way more.
Right. Well, in terms of having like emotional, playful, intimate confidences, yeah,
Hmm.
yeah. I
And
mean,
I always say, you know, that all of homophobia and transphobia is deeply rooted in misogyny because we
mm,
don't raise boys to be men, we raise them to not be women.
that's that's very wise. I think that's very true.
And that battle against anything that is feminine or considered feminine is like the root of almost all the evils that we have.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It absolutely is, and our resistance to women in power, and like what is it about this freaking country that we can't get a woman into the highest office? What is that about? Like I mean obviously that speaks to how incredibly entrenched
Hmm.
in our cells, the cells that make us, it is that we cannot allow a woman to be in that role, and how much better the world would be if we had that sensibility.
Well, and part of that is, again, introspection is not one of those qualities that's nurtured. So,
Right. And respect and honoring of people's inner lives
right,
and feelings and vulnerabilities. Truly the stuff that makes us humans and not Ken dolls.
right. Hold on one second. I'm back. Sorry.
That's okay.
um, what were we saying? I'm sorry.
We're just talking about Western imperialist expansion and its connection to the. We were talking about the big stuff. We're talking big ideas.
I love how that tends to happen on this show.
Yeah.
It's like we go from my book to the meaning of life.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah.
but one could argue that in your story, those two concepts are not mutually exclusive. Please and thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for reading it.
Because your story is really, of course, it is your story, but it is also an exploration of the dynamics of relationships,
Hmm.
the uh, personal journeys of self-discovery, family dynamics. Like, there's just so many big uh, capital letter, subjects that are touched on in your story. And I'm grateful that I got to read it.
Oh, that's so lovely to hear. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And I definitely want to say that it has been a pleasure talking to you.
Oh, and likewise, you're very skilled at putting people at ease.
Oh, well, thank you. I'm very glad to hear that. Um, if we wanted to learn more about you
Mhm.
and where to purchase the book,
Yeah.
where would we go?
You can go to my website, which is waynescottwrites.com, and that will lead you to the website of Black Lawrence Press, which is the small independent press that published the memoir and has been wonderful to me. And we should always, of course, support the little guys, the small
Yes.
independent presses. So if people buy directly from Black Lawrence, that would be the most amazing thing. They knew when I first found them, they recognized that it was such a vulnerable, intimate story, and they were really clear to me that they were going to protect it, and they were going to
Right.
be they were going to be they were going to be careful with me as I kind of moved into this kind of capitalist commercial economy of book buying, that they were going to be protective, and I always appreciated that about them.
I love it. I love it. And we will make sure to include that information in the notes of this episode
Thank you so much.
the book is currently available.
It is. Hmm.
Okay, yes. So make sure that everyone within the sound of our voice gets your own copy of this book. It is a wonderful, wonderful story. The title of the book is The Maps They Gave Us: One Marriage Reimagined. It's not often that I gush over a book. I'm glad that, I'm always glad when it's a good read.
Hmm.
I love authentic stories. I
Hmm.
love wit. I love humor. I love honesty, and all of that is contained in this
Hmm.
story. And you should be very proud. One more quick question:
Yeah.
if there was going to be a movie,
Mm.
who would play you?
I actually know the answer to this immediately because my in my writers group we did this. We were all writing books, memoirs, and we all had to figure out who was going to play us. I think Noah Reed would play me from
Noah
Schitt's Creek.
Reed.
Schitt's Creek. Remember
Ah,
David's boyfriend in Schitt's Creek.
okay, 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 okay.
Yeah.
Nice. Okay.
So like.
Did you? Okay, all right. So, do you have a dream cast for anyone else in your
Mm,
head?
mm. My spouse, I think, would be played of. They're in different generations, but I always think of Laura Dern when I think of my spouse. Um,
Okay. All
But she's
right.
different generationally from Noah Reid. But I think about the span of her career. I could see Laura Dern in that role, and then actually the couples counselor, the brilliant couples counselor that we went to, Lene, who's a big character in the book. She would be played by Alexandra Billings. Do you know Alex?
Yes.
Am I right? Wouldn't that be like so if Alexander, if you're out there, this book is waiting for you. This is the role. So.
Part of me thinks that Alexandra Billings listens to this show, so I think you might have done something. And I would not have thought of that when reading the book, but now that you say it, yes, that is the right choice. Yes. So
see, I got it all cast out. Somebody from Hollywood just needs to give me a call. I'll pick it up.
Well, now I can't wait for the movie.
That's right.
So, Wayne Scott, thank you so much for joining me here
Charles.
At the Full Circle Table. You are a delight.
As are you.
Thank you. And I have a feeling this is not going to be the last time we sit and chat.
I hope so.
Thank you very much, and you have a wonderful day.
You too.
Take care.
You too.
Full Circle is a Never Scared Productions podcast, hosted by Charles Tyson Jr. and Martha Madrigal, produced and edited by Never Scared, executive produced by Charles Tyson Jr. and Martha Madrigal. Our theme and music is by the Jingleberries. All names, pictures, music, audio, and video clips are registered trademarks and/or copyrights of their respective copyright holders.